Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today's video we are going to continue to talk about fantasy football, and we are going to be going through every single team, previewing them for the 2021 fantasy football season. Today we are talking about the Minnesota Vikings. So I've gone through every team alphabetically listed before Minnesota, so if you want to check that out, please take a look at my channel and you'll see the team preview of that team. I'm going to go through every position player of importance and talk about what I think of them and what I would do if I was a fantasy football owner to help you win a fantasy football title this year. So yeah, before we get into this video, if you know the name of the song that I started out with, please guess in the comment section below, and I will mention you on the channel and answer one of your fantasy football questions as well. So if you notice, nobody has done that yet on my videos, so if you go back and try to guess the song on some of the videos that I've done before, you can get multiple questions answered. I'm just putting that out there. So also on my channel, I do a lot of different content. I make song reactions. I also make song covers as well. I'm going to do some NBA stuff and some Olympic stuff, hopefully too. So if you're interested in all that, please check out my channel for a wide variety of content. Consider liking, commenting, or subscribing to the channel. All right, so we will go to the Minnesota Vikings, and first we're going to start with their schedule. So, unlike a lot of the teams that I've talked about, Minnesota has a very light schedule to start the season in terms of their defensive matchups. So, for Minnesota, these are players that you want to consider selling high on after the first couple weeks of the season because their schedule gets significantly more difficult with their defensive matchups as the season goes along. So we'll take a look at their schedule in particular. For week one, they start out at the Cincinnati Bengals. That is not a good defense at all. Expect great numbers from Dalvin Cook, etc. I'll get into the individual players in a sec. Then they go to the Arizona Cardinals. That's going to be an improved defense in my opinion, but still could have the potential to be a high-scoring game. Then they play Seattle, which is an up-and-down defense. Particularly to start last year, they were very poor, so could very well happen again. Cleveland Browns, could be a difficult defense there. But then some great matchups, Detroit Lions, Carolina Panthers, bye week, Dallas Cowboys. So week 1 through 8, you're looking at a lot of great matchups other than the bye week. But then things get a lot more difficult after the season. So that's why I would advocate around week 7, 8, around when they're bye and after they play the Dallas Cowboys. Consider selling high on these Minnesota Vikings players because it gets a lot more difficult. They go to the Baltimore Ravens, expects to be a very good defense. Then they go to the Los Angeles Chargers, which is another team that, as I talked about in their video earlier, they're getting Joey Bosa back. So could be a much improved defense as well. Then they've got some other difficult matchups to include going to San Francisco versus Pittsburgh at home, at Chicago, and versus the Los Angeles Rams at home. So, and then they play Chicago again later on this season. So, particularly the fantasy football playoffs are tough for them, but especially that later stretch of the season, there's a lot more difficult matchups for them. They've got what's projected to be their fantasy football playoff schedule could include Chicago twice if you're playing that last week in one of those formats. The Los Angeles Rams, which is one of the best defenses in football, and then the Green Bay Packers, which, it's not necessarily a great defense per se, but that's projected to be an outdoor game in January 2nd. So it could be a very bad weather conditions, not great offensive numbers there as well. So just keep stuff like that in mind because you might want to consider selling some of these players high at the beginning of the season because they could start out very well and then have a more difficult time in the fantasy football playoffs. So it's good to consider trying to flip some of them for players that have better fantasy football schedules in the playoffs. And if you want to go back to individual teams to see players and teams that I think have good schedules going into the fantasy football playoffs, you can go back and check out one of my videos where I talk about it. So we will go now to the quarterback position. And the Minnesota Vikings quarterback is Kirk Cousins. So Kirk Cousins, he's not a bad quarterback. He's proven that he's about a middle tier type of quarterback. He was he's a guy that you could pretty much count upon as in certain situations as a stream quarterback, but he's not really going to blow you away with numbers that'll justify, in my opinion, taking him particularly high. So we look at his numbers from last year. He was the number 11 quarterback in fantasy football, so right around the level of somebody that you're going to be either drafting at the very end of the draft or picking up on waivers. That's about the level that I think he will go. He's kind of at the position now where he's not necessarily getting the huge hype that he did in the past. But total last year, he had 4,265 yards. He had 35 touchdowns. He had 13 interceptions. Not great necessarily in that category. And a 67.6 completion percentage. So he's serviceable enough to give you some decent value as a starting level quarterback, but he's not somebody that you're going to want to be drafting particularly high. And I think you can make a case for picking him up at the beginning of the season based on their schedule that he has as a guy that you can get late in the draft. But again, another thing to keep in mind with this team is that they're very much based around Dalvin Cook. It's very run-heavy offense. There are certain games where if they could just continue to pound the rock and have the running back just continue to push the pile, then Kirk Cousins is not going to really be needed a lot. Mike Zimmer is not afraid to do that, and because of that, Kirk Cousins has been known in the past to have some poor games because of that. Didn't necessarily happen a lot this past year because they were behind a lot, so Kirk Cousins kind of had to throw a little more than he usually would. But still, this is a guy that he could be good value for you, but he's not somebody that I'm necessarily looking to take particularly high. But again, favorable schedule to start the season, so you might want to consider him as a worthy stream candidate or a late round quarterback add in the draft if you're going to play the game of streaming quarterbacks. But don't really see him as a long-term starter throughout the whole season and somebody that you should particularly prioritize taking very high. So now we move to the running back position. And starting running back for the Minnesota Vikings is Dalvin Cook. Dalvin Cook was excellent last season. His numbers for you, 1,557 yards. That was second in the NFL with Derrick Henry, who ran for over 2,000 yards. He rushed for over 111 yards a game. That is excellent production there. He had 16 touchdowns, average of 5 yards a carry on 312 attempts. This is the definition of just an every down back that you can rely upon, and this team is going to make the focal point of their offense, as I talk about. So Dalvin Cook was actually pretty consistent throughout the season, too. He scored a touchdown in his first 7 games of the season. He only had 3 games in the season in which he didn't score a touchdown. He also had over 8 games of over 100 yards, including having a game against Detroit where he ran for over 200 yards. He had a game against Green Bay where he ran for 3 touchdowns and 30 attempts. And this guy just is a consistent player you can rely upon. And there's a legitimate argument to be made that Dalvin Cook might be the number 1 pick in the fantasy football draft. And the reason being is because a lot of the other players that you're considering taking up there, such as Christian McCaffrey, Derrick Henry, Alvin Kamara, those top 4 are the ones that come to mind for me. You can maybe consider Saquon Barkley as well as the 5th. But Kamara is having a significant change to his offense with Drew Brees being gone. Derrick Henry is adding Julio Jones to his team. They also lose Arthur Smith, their offensive coordinator, so those are potential knocks that kind of leave you wondering about him. Saquon Barkley, what is he going to look like coming back from his ACL injury? And then you have Christian McCaffrey, who is adding Sam Darnold. So how is the offense going to look with Sam Darnold versus Teddy Bridgewater? How is McCaffrey going to do under a full season of Matt Rule, which he hasn't really shown us yet? So that all those arguments can be made to say that Dalvin Cook could be the number 1 running back taken in the number 1 overall player taken in fantasy football. I personally don't agree with that. I would, in my opinion, my number 1 draft pick, if I was drafting one, would be Christian McCaffrey. because, especially in a PPR league, because of the value that he gives you, both receiving and running the ball. But I think that if you were in a standard league, you can make a legitimate argument for Dalvin Cook, and that's somebody that I might consider as well, depending on how the season plays as it goes along. But Cook has the most stability of those guys in terms of the team mostly being the same as last year, and they also added Christian Darrisaw as offensive tackle, so that gives them even more stability on the line. So a lot of things working in Dalvin Cook's favor to be very productive this year. I'm a huge fan of him, but again, keep in mind he's got a more difficult playoff schedule, so that is one thing to keep in mind if you do decide to take Dalvin Cook at the beginning as your number one overall pick or top 5, wherever you end up drafting him. Next, we talk about Alexander Mattison. And I haven't talked a lot about handcuffs so far, but this is an excellent handcuff that shows you the value of running backs. So I'm going to talk real quick about running backs. So when you're building your fantasy football lineup, for me personally, I always make sure I have at least 6 running backs on my team, minimum. And I try to get as close to the maximum of 8 if I can, because running backs are some of the most productive positions in fantasy football in terms of what they can provide, but they're also the most injured position. So a lot of stuff is changing all the time with running backs, and you always have to try to stay one step ahead of the game. Try to make sure that you're setting yourself up for success if anything were to happen to starting level running backs with backup running backs in your team. So let's say, and I'm not wishing this upon him or anything like that, but let's say that if for some reason Dalvin Cook gets hurt, then Alexander Mattison is stepping into a position where he could literally give you top 10 level production with borderline top 5 production as a backup running back who's generally going to go last half of the fantasy football draft. So all that being said, this guy gives you so much value as a player that you can have as a backup running back, because if anything were to happen to Dalvin Cook, then you're basically holding on to a piece of gold that could be ready to explode. Also, this gives you a good trade chip as well if you're trying to make a trade with the Dalvin Cook owner, basically saying that, if you're trying to trade for a better player, you're trying to upgrade your receiver, for example, you have a package that includes your receiver that you're trying to trade, and then you also attach Alexander Mattison in that trade to the Dalvin Cook owner, and you can acquire that receiver that you want, which is going to give him value too, because if anything were to happen to his number one running back, then he's got the handcuff. So these are things that I'm going to talk about as the season goes along, but make sure that you're really paying a close eye on the handcuffs as well. And guys like Alexander Mattison is the prime example of a handcuff that you're going to want, because we know for sure that this guy has been productive when he's gotten his touches. He is in a system where they rely heavily on the offense or on running the ball. So Alexander Mattison presents a ton of value for you if you're going to have him as a handcuff. I'm definitely going to target him late in drafts. Other running backs of note that they have on this team, Ameer Abdullah is a guy who's been around for quite a while, who kind of was brought onto the team late to help give them some depth at the end of last season. I'm not particularly high on him, but if anything were to happen to Dalvin Cook and then you're rolling out Alexander Mattison, then I would start looking at Abdullah as a handcuff. And then a rookie that they drafted in, I believe, the 4th round. Yeah, the 4th round is Kene Nwangwu. I hope I pronounced his name correctly. He's a rookie running back out of Iowa State. Again, he doesn't necessarily have a lot of interest to me at this time, but he's a guy that, if anything were to happen, he's got a lot of opportunity to step up and be a valuable handcuff for you on this team. So somebody worth keeping an eye on just because of the system. Now we move to wide receivers. And these are 2 other receivers that I really like that I'm going to talk about in Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen. So for quite a while, the Minnesota Vikings have been an offensive team that pretty much relies on 2 receivers. And then after that, it's very murky in terms of just the opportunity that they'll have. So this is why I was very high on Justin Jefferson last season, is because when Stephon Diggs was traded and they drafted Justin Jefferson with a first-round pick, he took advantage of that two-receiver offense. Kirk Cousins likes going to two receivers primarily, and both him and Adam Thielen are both quite productive. So we'll start with Justin Jefferson. Rookie last season, obviously very productive, got a Pro Bowl in his first season. He also finished, I believe, number 5 overall in PPR. Let me double check this. Number 6. So right about top 5. So he gives you excellent value, and he really came on strong, especially late in the season. So Justin Jefferson, it took him a little while to get going. He only had 1 touchdown in his first 5 games, but then, and also first 5 games, max number of targets that he got was 9. A couple of games where he only had 3 targets. But then later on in the season, 5 of the last 6 games, he had at least 10 targets. So that shows me that he's gaining his confidence with Kirk Cousins and getting more involved in this offense. And also in those games, he had 4 of those 6 games, he had at least 85 yards. So he's giving you a lot of production with receiving yards more so than touchdowns. But I suspect the touchdowns will come as he matures and gets more familiar with an NFL offense. But he showed excellent promise, and he's getting that involvement in this offense that I really like. He did kind of have some up and down games early in the season, but as the season went along, he was a little more consistent, and I think this will continue to improve. So Justin Jefferson, a guy that I really like. I'm not 100% sure if I would reach for him at this time, but he is a guy that is going to get involved with this offense because there simply isn't really a whole lot other than him and Adam Thielen that they can consistently rely upon as receiving options for them. Speaking of which, we now move to Adam Thielen. So Thielen was very good last year. He was the number 10 receiver in fantasy football for PPR formats. But keep in mind, a lot of this was because he had 14 touchdowns. So very high level of touchdowns for receivers. And there's reason to suggest that Thielen could repeat that, and it just shows that he's got that rapport with Kirk Cousins that he's going to always be a red zone target. But a lot of Adam Thielen's numbers were actually carried by his touchdowns. So we look at some of his games he had last season. Against the Chicago Bears, he got a touchdown that game, but he only had 2 receptions for 11 yards. So if he didn't have a touchdown, that kind of wouldn't have salvaged his game. The game before that, he had 3 receptions for 39 yards. Not a very good performance there. Another game against Detroit, he had 2 receptions, 38 yards. 3 receptions, 27 yards. So he's very touchdown dependent based on his performance last season. So I have a little more concern with Adam Thielen, but I also think that he's going to probably get drafted around the range that is going to be worth his value. So that means that I'm still relatively confident in him and the opportunity he's going to get. But I think this offense is more leaning towards Justin Jefferson as their number 1 receiver than Adam Thielen. But he still is a good receiver to have, and he's got the familiarity with Kirk Cousins and that offense that I think he will still be a very productive football player for you. Other players of note on this receiving core, Chad Beebe, a guy who's kind of come up through the system much like Adam Thielen did, but hasn't really broken out at all. He's a guy that I'm not very high on at all. He's only really a stream candidate for me at best. He only had 20 receptions last year for 201 yards. So, I mean, he'll give you some promise at times, but he's not worth a draft pick to me. And then Bisi Johnson, pretty much the same boat, except he was less productive than Chad Beebe. So even more so, just the guy you want to monitor on waivers in case one of them gets hurt. And actually, Bisi Johnson, when either Stephon Diggs or I think Adam Thielen was hurt in 2019 a lot. So they had to rely on Stephon Diggs a lot, and Bisi Johnson was kind of the guy that ended up taking up a lot of the slack. So he might be able to fill it, but still at this time, just a guy you want to monitor on waivers. And then a 7th-round pick that they got, a 5th-round pick that they got out of Iowa is Ameer Smith-Marsette. He's got potential to step up as the 3rd receiver on this team, but at this time, I think if you want to take a flyer on him at the draft, at the one of the later rounds of the draft, I don't necessarily have a problem with it, but I'm not particularly high on his upside at this time. Tight end. So, tight end that I like going into the season, who I think is flying under the radar, is Irv Smith. So, Irv Smith, last season, we take a look at his numbers. He had 30 receptions, 365 yards, and 5 touchdowns. And keep in mind, last season they were running a 2 tight end offense very much so with Kyle Rudolph, who's now in New York playing for the Giants. He had 28 receptions for 334 yards and a touchdown. So, in theory, now that this offense is more so leaning towards Irv Smith, and they don't really have that 2 tight end split anymore, there's room to suggest that Irv Smith could take a lot of those receptions away and actually become a pretty productive player in fantasy football. He's going into his 3rd season. He's got some familiarity with the offense now. Mike Zimmer likes running offenses that involve tight ends in the system because they're a big run offense. So I think Irv Smith could have a lot of success going into the season. And he's a guy that you're probably going to be able to get pretty late in the draft because he's not very well known, hasn't really broken out yet, but provides a lot of upside just based on the opportunity that's presented in front of him. Really like Irv Smith going into the season. I would consider taking him if you're trying to get a tight end late in the draft. Some other guys, they've got Tyler Conklin. He was mildly productive last season as well, but I would not consider him at all, even as a stream candidate, unless Irv Smith gets hurt. We move to the defense now, and the defense has some talented players like Harrison Smith, Anthony Barr, things like that. So they've got some talent, but they were kind of not as productive last season, and that kind of shows me that they might potentially be getting a little older. They added Patrick Peterson, so that's good. But for this defense, potential to be overdrafted, in my opinion. So unless they fall into that second to last round where I say to take defenses, I would not look at them at all, personally. Not super high on them, but they do have some stream upside at times. And then their kicker is Greg Joseph. Last season, Dan Bailey was an absolute disaster, and he is now not employed in the NFL, which is not really a surprise to me anymore. But Greg Joseph, a guy, he maybe could have some stream opportunity at times, but he's not really a guy I'm really looking at all unless he shows me that he's going to have some consistency in this offense first. So that's all I got on the Vikings. Next, we will go to the New England Patriots, which is a team I definitely have some interesting takes on. So if you're interested in that, please continue to stay tuned to these videos. And let me know what you think in the comments section. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.